In the quiet hours before dawn, when the Mediterranean world still slumbered, beneath blankets of stars, there lived a dream so audacious that even the gods might have paused to listen. Picture, if you will, the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor stones of New Carthage, where torchlight flickered like fireflies against the ancient walls, and the salt-sweet air carried whispers of an impossible journey. The year was 218 before the Common Era, and in the hushed corridors of a great house overlooking the sea, a young commander sat by candlelight, his fingers tracing routes across maps made of precious papyrus. The flame danced softly, casting warm shadows that seemed to breathe life into the mountains drawn in careful, flowing lines. These were not mere sketches of stone and snow, they were the stuff of legend, the backbone of the world, the great alpine peaks that had never known the footfall of armies. Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, heir to dreams deferred, sat in the amber glow, and felt the weight of his father's unfulfilled promises settling on his shoulders like a comfortable cloak. The room smelled of olive oil and parchment, of the cedar wood from which his desk was carved, and faintly, always faintly, of the sea that had carried his ancestors to glory and ruin in equal measure. Outside his window, the harbor waters reflected the last of the evening stars, each point of light doubled in the gentle swells, creating a constellation both above and below. Night fishermen moved like shadows between their nets, their voices carrying across the water in soft, rhythmic calls that spoke of tides and time and the endless patience of those who live by the sea's grace. The maps before him told stories older than memory, trade routes worn smooth by generations of merchants, mountain passes known only to shepherds and their flocks, rivers that sang different songs in different seasons. His finger paused at the representation of the great peaks, those towering guardians that separated the known world from the realm of Rome. No army had ever crossed them. No general had ever dared dream it possible. But dreams, like rivers, have a way of finding their course through the most impossible terrain. The candle burned lower, its warm light growing softer still, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out across the water, a sound both lonely and comforting, like all the best sounds that accompany the birth of great endeavors. The scent of jasmine drifted through the open shutters, mixed with the ever-present salt breeze that spoke of journeys yet to come. In this quiet moment, as the world held its breath between one day and the next, a plan was taking shape that would echo through the centuries, not with the clash of swords or the thunder of war cries, but with the patient persistence of one man's impossible dream and the gentle footsteps of those who would follow him into legend. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, marking time as they had since the world was young, and the Mediterranean lapped against the shore with the rhythm of a sleeping giant's breath, knowing nothing of the morrow, caring only for the eternal now of wave and wind and the soft progression of one peaceful moment into the next. To understand the gentle audacity of what was to come, one must first breathe in the world as it existed in those distant days, when the Mediterranean was not merely a sea but the center of all civilized life, a great blue heart around which the known world arranged itself in comfortable familiarity. The western Mediterranean in Hannibal's time moved to rhythms as old as olive trees and as predictable as the seasonal winds. From the Pillars of Hercules to the shores of Sicily, merchant vessels traced the same routes their grandfathers had known, carrying grain from North Africa, silver from Spain, pottery from Greece. And always, always, the olive oil that bound the civilized world together in its golden embrace. Carthage herself sat like a jewel upon the North African coast, her harbors reflecting the sky in two perfect circles, one for merchant vessels, one for the ships of war. The city rose from the water in terraces of white stone and red tile, her buildings climbing the gentle hills like steps leading to the temple of Tanit that crowned the highest point. From this sacred place, one could see across the narrow stretch of water to Sicily, and beyond, to the hazy blue outline of the Italian peninsula where Rome grew stronger with each passing season. But it was not in Carthage that our story found its truest beginning. Instead, we must look westward, to the Iberian Peninsula, where young Hannibal had learned the patience of governance and the weight of command in the dusty, sun-warmed city of New Carthage. Here, in this settlement that clung to the Spanish coast like a child to its mother's robes, the rhythms of life followed patterns both ancient and immediate. Dawn came early, painted in shades of rose and gold across the harbor, where fishermen were already hauling in nets heavy with the night's catch. The scent of Wood smoke rose from cooking fires, mingling with the salt air and the earthy aroma of bread baking in clay ovens. The young commander's household awakened with the sun, servants padding through corridors on bare feet, their footsteps soft as whispers on the marble floors. Water carriers moved in and out like gentle tides, filling amphoras from the wells and cisterns that caught and held the precious rain. In the kitchen courtyards, grinding stones turned with meditative persistence, transforming grain into flour with the same patient circular motion that had fed civilization since the world was young. Hannibal himself rose with the light, as was his custom, stepping onto his private balcony to breathe the morning air and watch the harbor come alive. His routine was simple and unchanging: a wash in cool water from a bronze basin, a breakfast of bread and honey and olives, a cup of watered wine that caught the early light like liquid amber. These small rituals anchored him to the world of the possible, even as his thoughts drifted constantly toward the impossible. The Spanish tribes that lived beyond the city's walls had taught him much about the art of moving through difficult terrain. He had spent years learning their ways, riding with their horsemen across the high plains where the grass grew silver in the wind, listening to their stories of mountain passes and hidden valleys, of the secret paths that connected one world to another. From the Iberian warriors, he learned that every mountain had its moods, its tempers and its gentleness, its seasons of welcome and its times of warning. They spoke of the great peaks to the north with the reverence one reserves for sleeping giants, beings of such immense power that they must be approached with patience, respect, and perfect understanding of one's own smallness in their presence. The elephants had come from Africa, across the narrow straits where Europe and Africa nearly touch, great gray shapes that moved with surprising gentleness across the dusty training grounds outside the city walls. These creatures, massive as moving hills, possessed an intelligence that seemed almost human, and a patience that put even the most disciplined soldiers to shame. Watching them train was like observing a dance performed in slow motion, each movement deliberate and meaningful. Their handlers, dark-skinned men from the lands below the great desert, spoke to their charges in soft, clicking languages that seemed to bypass the mind and speak directly to some deeper understanding. The elephants responded with trunk touches and rumbling sounds that vibrated through the earth, conversations in a tongue older than civilization. The animals required constant care, their rough skin needed daily attention with oil and sand, their feet demanded inspection and treatment, their diet consisted of enormous quantities of grain, hay, and fruit that had to be gathered from across the region. Yet they asked for so little in return: gentle words, consistent treatment, and the kind of respect one gives to a wise elder whose knowledge runs deeper than books or scrolls. In the evenings, when the training was done and the elephants had been fed and groomed, they would stand in their enclosures like great gray boulders, swaying slightly from side to side in a rhythm that seemed to match some internal music, some elephant lullaby that spoke of distant forests and the comfort of the herd. The soldiers who would accompany this great venture came from across the known world, each group bringing their own customs, their own ways of understanding warfare and survival. There were Libyans with their painted shields and deadly spears, men whose ancestors had fought beside the great Hamilcar in wars whose echoes still stirred the dust. Spanish warriors rode horses with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle, their long hair braided with bronze rings that caught the sunlight like small suns. Gallic mercenaries, tall and fierce-looking, spoke languages that sounded like wind through forests, and carried swords longer than a man's arm with the casual familiarity of those who had been born with weapons in their hands. Yet in camp, around the cooking fires in the evening, these same fierce warriors sang lullabies to their children and mended clothes with the patience of grandmothers. The provisioning of such a force required planning that stretched across months and seasons. Quartermasters worked through the cooling nights, their oil lamps burning until dawn as they calculated and recalculated the quantities of grain, oil, wine, and dried meat that would be needed for a journey whose duration could only be guessed at. Supply wagons were reinforced with iron bands, their wheels wrapped with leather to muffle their passage, their axles greased with fat rendered from cattle that had grazed the Spanish hills under gentle summer skies. Maps were copied and recopied on precious parchment, each route marked in different colored inks that had been mixed with ingredients as exotic as their destinations: red ochre from the mountains, blue from ground lapis lazuli, black from the soot of burned olive wood. These documents represented years of patient inquiry, conversations with traders and shepherds, bribes paid to guides. And translators, the careful accumulation of knowledge that transformed the impossible into the merely extremely difficult. As autumn approached and the great plan neared its moment of birth, the very air around New Carthage seemed to hold its breath. In the markets, merchants spoke in hushed tones of strange preparations, of elephants being fitted with leather armor and soldiers practicing formations that had never been seen before. Children played new games in the dusty streets, pretending to be great beasts climbing mountains, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze that smelled of olive groves and distant possibilities. The morning of departure arrived not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet inevitability of sunrise itself. Long before the first light touched the harbor walls of New Carthage, the great encampment that had sprawled across the coastal plain for months was already stirring with the soft sounds of preparation. In the pre-dawn darkness, lit only by the scattered glow of oil lamps and cooking fires, thousands of souls moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had rehearsed this moment in their dreams. Tent poles were struck with careful precision, their canvas coverings folded with the same attention one might give to precious cloth. Personal belongings disappeared into leather satchels and woven baskets with the fluid motion of water finding its level. The elephants were the first to be made ready, these gentle giants requiring more time and attention than any other element of the great column. Their handlers, the mahouts from distant Numidia, moved among their charges like mothers preparing children for a long journey. Each massive foot was inspected, cleaned, and treated with oils that had been boiled with herbs known only to elephant keepers. The thick skin was rubbed down with sand and palm oil until it gleamed like polished stone, and then carefully draped with protective leather that had been softened over fires of aromatic wood. The creatures accepted this attention with the patience of ancient beings who understood that human fussing was simply one of the inevitable conditions of existence. They swayed gently from side to side, their great eyes blinking slowly in the lamplight, while their trunks explored the familiar scents and textures of their handlers. Occasionally, a rumbling sound would emerge from deep within their chests, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself and spoke of contentment, of trust, of readiness for whatever lay ahead. Watching this preparation unfold was like observing a ritual that had been performed since the beginning of time. The mahouts spoke to their elephants in voices soft as water over stones, their words a mixture of command and endearment that required no translation. They fed them special treats, dates stuffed with honey, fresh branches from olive trees, small loaves of bread that had been blessed by the priests of Tanit, and with each offering, the bond between human and beast grew stronger, more ready for the challenges that lay ahead. The horses, too, required their own careful preparation. Spanish cavalry horses, bred for endurance and sure-footedness, stood quietly while their handlers braided protective charms into their manes and whispered prayers over their ears. Their hooves were checked and cleaned, their shoes examined for looseness or wear, their legs wrapped with strips of linen that had been soaked in oils meant to prevent strain and injury. These animals possessed an intelligence different from that of the elephants. Quicker, more nervous, but no less profound. They sensed the unusual nature of the day in the way horses always do, through channels of understanding that bypass human comprehension. Their ears flicked constantly, their nostrils expanded to catch every scent the morning breeze carried, and their eyes held the bright awareness of creatures who knew they were about to embark on something far beyond their usual experience. The soldiers, meanwhile, moved through their own preparations with the methodical efficiency of professional warriors. Equipment was checked and double-checked, not with the frantic energy of those preparing for battle, but with the careful attention of craftsmen ensuring their tools were perfect. Spears were examined for cracks in the wood, spear points tested for sharpness and secure mounting. Shield straps were adjusted and readjusted until they fell exactly right across shoulders and arms. Personal gear was distributed according to principles that had been developed through years of experience. Each man carried a water skin made from the bladder of a goat, seasoned until it was both flexible and waterproof. Food supplies were divided into daily rations wrapped in oiled cloth that would protect them from moisture and pests. Spare sandals, needle and thread, small bronze knives, fire-making materials, all the tiny necessities that made the difference between survival and disaster on a long march were tucked away in places where they could be found even in complete darkness. The loading of the supply wagons proceeded with the same unhurried precision. Grain was sealed in amphoras that had been waterproofed with pitch, their openings covered with leather tied down with cord that had been specially treated to resist rot. Wine was carried in smaller vessels, mixed with water and herbs that would help prevent spoilage during the long journey ahead. Olive oil, that most essential of all provisions, traveled in specially constructed containers that could survive the jolting and shaking of mountain paths. Medical supplies received particular attention, for everyone understood that injury and illness were as much a part of any great journey as sunrise and sunset. Bandages made from the finest linen were rolled and stored in waterproof cases. Healing herbs gathered from across the Mediterranean world were carefully sorted and labeled: willow bark for pain and fever, honey for wounds, wine mixed with myrrh for cleansing injuries. The physicians who would accompany the march checked and rechecked their bronze instruments, their precious stores of knowledge copied onto scrolls that were wrapped in oiled leather and stored in the centers of the supply wagons where they would be best protected from the elements. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the great column began to take its final shape. This was not the chaotic rushing of armies departing in haste, but something more like the careful assembly of a great religious procession, each element taking its place according to principles that had been worked out through months of planning and preparation. The advance guard consisted of light cavalry and scouts, men whose business it was to read the landscape ahead and identify potential problems before they could become disasters. These riders carried minimal equipment but possessed the kind of deep knowledge of terrain and weather that could mean the difference between life and death in the mountains. They knew how to read clouds and wind patterns, how to identify safe water sources, how to recognize the signs that marked the beginning of a storm system still hours away. Behind them came the main body of infantry, arranged not for battle but for the grinding work of covering distance day after day across terrain that would test every limit of human endurance. These men had been selected not just for their fighting skills but for their ability to suffer hardship without complaint, to maintain discipline when exhaustion and discomfort would have broken lesser men. They moved with the steady, measured pace of those who understood that the journey ahead would be won not through dramatic gestures but through the accumulation of thousands of small victories over pain, fatigue, and despair. The elephants occupied a place of honor in the center of the column, surrounded by their handlers and a special guard of veteran soldiers whose sole responsibility was the welfare of these magnificent beasts. Each elephant was accompanied by several pack animals carrying the special foods and medicines that would keep them healthy during the journey. Bales of hay and sacks of grain were distributed throughout the supply train so that if one wagon was lost or damaged, the elephants would not suffer. The great creatures moved with a dignity that seemed to transform the entire nature of the march. Where other armies might have seemed like predators on the move, the presence of the elephants gave the column something of the character of a migration, a great natural movement of life across the landscape. Children from nearby settlements came out to watch them pass, their eyes wide with wonder at these living mountains that walked with such surprising gentleness. Behind the elephants came the heavy supply wagons, their wheels wrapped with leather to muffle sound, their contents secured with ropes that had been tested and retested. These vehicles carried the difference between success and failure. Not just food and equipment, but the thousand small necessities that armies require: spare weapons, replacement gear, tools for maintaining equipment, materials for making repairs, medicines, and even entertainment for the long evenings when the march had stopped and men needed something to keep their spirits up. The wagons were pulled by oxen selected for strength and endurance rather than speed. These placid animals possessed the kind of steady temperament that would serve well in the mountains, where panic could mean disaster and patience was often the difference between finding a way forward and being forced to retreat. Their handlers were men who had spent their lives working with draft animals, who could read the subtle signs that indicated fatigue or illness, who knew how to coax maximum effort from their charges without pushing them beyond their limits. The rear guard consisted of more cavalry and selected infantry units, men whose job it was to ensure that nothing important was left behind and that the column's retreat was always protected. These soldiers also served as messengers, riding back and forth along the length of the march to carry information and orders from the commanders to the various unit leaders. As the column finally began to move, the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the morning mist and reveal the landscape that stretched ahead. From New Carthage, the route led northward through the coastal plain, a gentle beginning. That would allow the men and animals to settle into the rhythm of the march before the real challenges began. The countryside through which they passed seemed to doze in the morning. Warmth, olive groves and vineyards stretching away on either side of the road in neat rows that spoke of human patience and the slow accumulation of agricultural wisdom. Farm workers paused in their labors to watch the great column pass, shading their eyes with calloused hands and calling out greetings in the musical Spanish dialects that had flavored Hannibal's youth. The first day's march was deliberately short, designed more to identify problems with equipment and organization than to cover significant distance. By midday, the column had halted beside a stream that ran clear and cold from the distant mountains, its banks lined with poplars that provided welcome shade for men and animals alike. The process of making camp revealed the same careful organization that had characterized the morning's departure. Tents were erected according to a predetermined pattern that maximized security while ensuring that supplies could be distributed efficiently. Cooking fires were lit in designated areas where the smoke would disperse without revealing the exact size or location of the force to unfriendly eyes. Water discipline was established from the very first day, with clear rules about how the precious liquid was to be collected, purified, and distributed. Streams and springs were tested by experienced men who knew how to identify sources that might be contaminated or unsafe. Water was always boiled before being consumed, a practice that had saved more armies than all the famous victories combined. The elephants received particular attention during these rest periods, their feet examined for stones or injuries, their skin checked for abrasions that might become infected. They were led to the stream in small groups, where they delighted in splashing and spraying water over their backs with their trunks, a behavior that never failed to draw smiles from even the most hardened soldiers. Feeding such a great column required organization on a scale that few had ever attempted. Cooking fires burned from before dawn until after sunset, tended by men whose entire responsibility was the preparation of food. Grain was ground in portable mills, mixed with water and oil, and formed into flatbreads that could be cooked quickly on iron griddles. Dried meat was soaked in wine and water until it regained something of its original texture, then seasoned with herbs that made even the most monotonous rations palatable. The evening meals became times of quiet fellowship, soldiers sharing stories of their homelands and families while the day's heat slowly dissipated and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Different groups maintained their own customs and traditions, but the common experience of the march was already beginning to forge bonds that transcended old loyalties and divisions. Spanish cavalry sang haunting ballads that spoke of wide plains and distant mountains, their voices blending with the night sounds of insects and flowing water. Gallic warriors shared drinking songs that required no translation to communicate their meaning, while African infantrymen told stories that stretched back to the dawn of memory, tales of gods and heroes that seemed to merge seamlessly with the landscape through which they moved. The officers moved through the camp during these evening hours, not as inspectors or disciplinarians but as participants in the great shared endeavor. They listened to complaints and suggestions, settled disputes before they could become serious problems, and most importantly, maintained the delicate balance of authority and fellowship that would be essential during the difficult days ahead. Medical attention was provided not just for injuries and illness but for the thousand small problems that could become serious if ignored. Feet were examined and treated for blisters, muscles massaged to prevent stiffness, minor cuts and scrapes cleaned and bandaged. The physicians who accompanied the march possessed knowledge gathered from across the Mediterranean world, combining Greek theoretical understanding with practical experience gained through years of campaign life. Sleep came gradually to the great camp, beginning with the youngest soldiers and slowly spreading to the veterans who had learned to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself. Guards were posted according to a rotation that ensured everyone received adequate rest while maintaining security throughout the night. The password was changed daily, always chosen from words that would be difficult for potential enemies to pronounce correctly. The elephants slept standing up, as was their custom, swaying gently from side to side in a rhythm that seemed to match some internal music. Their presence in the camp created a sense of security that went beyond mere physical protection. These ancient beings carried with them something of the patience of geological time, a reminder that all things pass and all journeys eventually reach their destination. As the days passed and the column moved steadily northward through the Spanish countryside, a routine established itself that would carry them through all the challenges ahead. Dawn brought the same careful preparations, the same methodical checking of equipment and animals, the same patient organization of men and supplies into the great moving organism that had become their temporary world. The landscape gradually changed as they moved inland, the coastal plain giving way to rolling hills covered with oak forests and mountain meadows where wild flowers bloomed in profusion. The air grew cooler and clearer, carrying scents of pine and stone that spoke of the greater challenges that lay ahead. Rivers became more frequent and more challenging to cross, requiring the construction of temporary bridges or the location of fords that could accommodate the weight of loaded wagons and elephants. These crossings became exercises in engineering and cooperation, with soldiers from different units working together to solve problems that no individual could handle alone. The elephants proved surprisingly capable in the water, using their trunks as snorkels when the current ran too deep for normal breathing. They seemed to enjoy these river crossings, playing in the water like enormous children while their handlers watched with the mixture of affection and anxiety that parents feel when observing their charges at play. Mountain streams ran clearer and colder than those of the coastal regions, their water so pure it seemed to carry the taste of snow and stone. Soldiers filled their water skins with something approaching reverence, understanding that they were drinking from sources that had begun as snow on peaks they had not yet seen but would soon challenge. The nights grew cooler, requiring additional blankets and closer attention to the fires that provided warmth as well as light. Stars appeared with brilliant clarity in the mountain air, their patterns so sharp and distinct that even city-born soldiers began to learn the constellations that would guide them through the trackless regions ahead. Navigation became more complex as familiar coastal landmarks disappeared behind them, and the way forward led through territories that existed on maps as rough sketches rather than detailed drawings. Scouts ranged farther ahead, their reports becoming increasingly important as the margin for error grew smaller with each day's march. Local knowledge became precious beyond gold or silver, with guides recruited from among the mountain peoples who knew the secret paths and hidden valleys that would make the difference between success and disaster. These men possessed the kind of intimate understanding of terrain that could only be acquired through generations of living in harmony with the landscape. The Spanish tribesmen who joined them as guides moved through the mountains with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural to men accustomed to the flat coastal regions. They read the landscape like a familiar book, identifying weather patterns hours before they developed, locating water sources that would have remained hidden to outside eyes, finding paths where none seemed to exist. Communication with these guides required patience and creativity, as languages mixed and merged in a constantly evolving pidgin that combined gestures, drawing in the dirt, and the universal language of shared experience. Gradually, bonds formed between the guides and the regular soldiers, relationships based on mutual respect and the recognition that survival depended on cooperation. As the column climbed higher into the foothills of the great mountain range, the challenges multiplied, but so did the sense of shared purpose. Men who had begun the journey as members of separate units gradually became part of something larger, a single organism dedicated to the achievement of an impossible goal. The elephants adapted to the changing conditions with remarkable flexibility, their broad feet finding purchase on rocky surfaces that would have defeated horses, their powerful muscles enabling them to climb slopes that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. They became symbols of the entire enterprise, patient, determined, and possessed of an inner strength that transcended immediate difficulties. Evenings in the mountains brought spectacular sunsets that painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold, a beauty so overwhelming that even the most practical soldiers stopped their work to watch in silence. These moments of shared wonder became part of the binding that held the great column together, reminders that they were participants in something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. The approach to the Alps themselves was gradual, the foothills rising in gentle stages that allowed men and animals to adjust slowly to the thinner air and steeper grades. Each day brought views of higher peaks, snow-covered summits that seemed to float above the clouds like the dwelling places of gods. Local settlements became smaller and more infrequent as the column climbed higher, their inhabitants displaying the kind of self-sufficiency that mountains breed in those who call them home. These people watched the Great March pass with expressions that mixed curiosity, concern, and a deep understanding of just how challenging the path ahead would prove to be. The final approach to the great passes was made through valleys that seemed carved by the hands of giants, their walls rising so steeply that the sky appeared as a narrow ribbon of blue far overhead. Streams ran faster and colder here, there. Voices echoing from the stone walls in harmonies that spoke of ancient forces and the patient work of water over stone. In those final valleys before the great crossing, time seemed to move differently, as if the mountains themselves were teaching the lessons of patience that would be required for what lay ahead. The great column settled into a rhythm that matched the landscape around them, deliberate, careful, attuned to the subtle signals that meant the difference between safe passage and disaster. The elephants, those gentle giants who had become the symbols of the entire enterprise, seemed to understand intuitively that they were approaching something beyond normal experience. They moved with extra care now, their great feet testing each step before committing their full weight, their trunks constantly exploring the air currents that brought news of weather changes still hours away. Their handlers had grown even more attentive, if such a thing were possible, checking and rechecking the leather protections that shielded the precious feet, adjusting the blankets that would provide warmth during the cold mountain nights, ensuring that food supplies were distributed so that no elephant would ever be far from sustenance. The bond between man and beast had deepened during the long march, becoming something that transcended mere training or professional duty. Watching an elephant keeper work with his charge was like observing a conversation conducted entirely in touches and gentle sounds, a dialogue of mutual care that spoke to something fundamental about the relationship between different forms of consciousness. The great beasts would lower their massive heads to receive the whispered words of encouragement, their eyes holding an expression of such profound trust that even the most hardened soldiers felt moved by the sight. The soldiers themselves had been transformed by the journey, their bodies hardened by constant walking over increasingly difficult terrain, their minds focused by the daily challenge of maintaining discipline and cooperation under conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. They moved now with the fluid efficiency of men who had learned to think as parts of a larger organism, each individual aware of his role in the great shared endeavor. Evening conversations around the cooking fires had evolved into something approaching ritual, with men from different cultures sharing not just food but the deeper sustenance of story and song. Spanish cavalry would teach their comrades the haunting melodies that spoke of wide plains under endless skies, while Gallic warriors demonstrated the intricate word games that kept their minds sharp during long winter nights. African infantry contributed riddles and proverbs that carried the wisdom of desert peoples, insights into the nature of survival that had been tested against some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. These exchanges created a new kind of culture within the column, a fusion of traditions that would have seemed impossible in peacetime but emerged naturally from the crucible of shared challenge. The officers, too, had been changed by the experience of leading such a diverse force through such demanding conditions. They had learned to read not just maps and weather signs but the subtler indicators of morale and cohesion that determined whether a military unit would hold together under pressure or fragment into its component parts. They moved through the camp each evening, not as remote commanders but as participants in a great shared story. Medical care had evolved into something that addressed not just physical injuries, but the spiritual where that came from pushing beyond the normal limits of human experience. The physicians had learned to treat homesickness and despair with the same attention they gave to wounded feet and strained muscles, understanding that the mind and body were partners in the great work of survival. Supplies had been carefully managed throughout the journey, with reserves maintained for the most challenging portions that lay ahead. Every grain of wheat, every drop of oil, every scrap of metal that might be needed for repairs had been accounted for and protected. The quartermasters responsible for this vast logistical enterprise had developed systems of organization that would have impressed the administrators of the greatest cities. Yet for all the practical preparations, there was something more at work in the great column as it approached the final test. A spirit had emerged that transcended mere military discipline, a sense of participation in something that would be remembered long after all the participants had returned to the earth from which they came. The Alps rose before them now in all their terrible beauty, peaks that seemed to scrape the very foundations of heaven, their snow-covered summits catching the light of dawn and sunset in displays that left even practical soldiers speechless with wonder. These mountains possessed a presence that was almost personal, as if ancient beings were evaluating the worthiness of those who would attempt passage through their domain. The air itself was different here, thin enough to make each breath a conscious act, cold enough to remind everyone that they were approaching regions where human life existed only by sufferance of forces far greater than armies or ambition. Yet the column continued its steady progress, each day bringing them closer to passes that no army had ever attempted. Local guides spoke in hushed tones of the challenges ahead, narrow paths where a single misstep could mean death, weather that could change from clear skies to blizzard conditions in the space of minutes, cold that could freeze exposed flesh in the time it took to draw a few breaths. Yet they also spoke with something approaching reverence of the beauty that awaited those strong enough and fortunate enough to witness it. The elephants would be tested beyond anything in their experience, these creatures of warm climates asked to trust their human companions through conditions that violated every instinct developed over millions of years of evolution. Yet they continued to follow, their faith in their handlers stronger than fear of the unknown. As the great column made its final preparations for the crossing itself, a quiet settled over the camp that was different from the normal sounds of evening rest. Men checked and rechecked their equipment, not with the nervous energy of those facing battle but with the careful attention of craftsmen preparing for their masterwork. Personal items were secured or left behind, space in packs reserved for only the most essential supplies. Letters were written to families who might never see their loved ones again. Messages that spoke not of glory or conquest but of the simple human need to be remembered with love. These documents were entrusted to local guides who would carry them back down the mountains to the world of warm valleys and familiar skies. The elephants received extra attention during these final preparations, their handlers singing the gentle songs that had calmed them since childhood, their massive forms swaying to rhythms that seemed to connect them to the patient heartbeat of the earth itself. Special foods were prepared for them, mixtures of grain and honey that would provide quick energy during the most demanding portions of the climb. Prayers were offered to gods both familiar and foreign, for men facing such challenges quickly learn that all divine assistance is welcome regardless of its source. The priests who accompanied the column performed rituals that blended traditions from across the Mediterranean world, creating new forms of worship appropriate to circumstances that had never been encountered before. The night before the final ascent was marked not by speeches or ceremonies but by a deep quiet that seemed to rise from the mountains themselves. Men slept more soundly than they had in weeks, as if their bodies understood that the rest ahead would be measured and precious. The elephants stood in their protective circles, their breathing visible in the cold air, patient as mountains themselves. Dawn came with a clarity that seemed to cut through more than mere darkness. The peaks above caught fire with the first light, their snow fields blazing like beacons that could be seen across impossible distances. The air was so still that individual voices carried clearly from one end of the camp to the other, and the sound of preparation seemed muffled by the vastness of the landscape. And then, as the sun climbed higher and the great column began its final transformation from camp to moving column, something extraordinary happened. The elephants, those ancient symbols of patience and strength, began to move toward the narrow path that led upward into legend, their massive forms silhouetted against the snow like living proof that dreams could indeed take physical form. The soldiers followed, each step carrying them further from the familiar world of warm seas and olive groves, closer to a realm where human will would be tested against the fundamental forces that shaped the earth itself. Yet they moved not with the desperate energy of men facing destruction but with the steady determination of those who had found something worth risking everything to achieve. Behind them, the valleys they had traveled stretched away in a haze of blue distance, holding the memories of a dozen different peoples and cultures, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to live in harmony with landscapes both gentle and harsh. Ahead lay the unknown, that realm of snow and stone and thin air where legends were born. The last views of the familiar world showed a landscape dotted with the smoke of cooking fires, settlements that had welcomed and provisioned the great column. During its passage northward, children had gathered on hillsides to wave farewell To the elephants, their laughter carrying on the morning air like a blessing from the world they were leaving behind. As the great peaks closed around the column and the path began its serious climb toward heights that touched the edge of the sky itself, a profound quiet settled over the entire enterprise. This was no longer merely a march or even a military movement, it had become something closer to a pilgrimage, a journey toward understanding that transcended any single purpose or goal. The elephants led the way now, their patient wisdom serving as guidance for the humans who followed. Each step was deliberate, tested, confirmed before the full weight of the great creatures was committed. They seemed to understand that. They carried not just themselves but the dreams and hopes of everyone who had joined this impossible journey. And in that moment, as the great column disappeared into the high passes where snow lay eternal and the air itself seemed touched with magic, it became clear that some achievements transcend their immediate purposes. Win or lose, succeed or fail, the mere attempt to cross the Alps with elephants had already become something that would be remembered as long as humans told stories of courage and determination. The mountains received them with the ancient indifference of geological time, but also with something that might have been respect for the sheer audacity of the attempt. And somewhere in the thin air and brilliant light of the high peaks, the impossible became simply another step in the long journey of human dreams toward their fulfillment. The story would be told and retold, growing with each telling until it became part of the great treasury of tales that remind us what mortals can achieve when they dare to attempt what the reasonable world declares impossible. And always, at the heart of the story, would be the image of the elephants, patient, trusting, magnificent, carrying civilization itself across the backbone of the world. In the high places where snow never melts and the air carries the whisper of eternity, the great column passed like a dream between sleeping and waking. The elephants, those gentle carriers of impossible hopes, found their footing on paths that seemed designed for gods rather than earthly creatures. Each step echoed with the patience of ages, each breath carried the dreams of those who dared believe that mountains were merely obstacles waiting for the right combination of courage and persistence to transform them into gateways. The soldiers who followed learned in those crystalline heights that endurance is its own form of victory, that the act of attempting the impossible changes something fundamental in the soul of the attempt. They descended not just into Italy but into legend, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that they had walked with elephants through the realm of eagles and emerged as something more than they had been when the journey began. And now, as the stars trace their ancient paths above those same peaks, as the snow falls on passes that remember the weight of great feet and the sound of human voices raised in song against the vastness, may you find rest beside these stories of quiet courage and patient dreams. May your sleep be filled with the gentle swaying of elephants in the darkness, the soft breathing of those who trust in journeys whose destinations lie beyond the horizon of the known world. Sleep well, fellow traveler, and dream of mountains that exist to be crossed, of paths that appear beneath the feet of those brave enough to take the first step, and of the ancient truth that some destinations can only be reached by those willing to believe that the impossible is simply another word for a dream that has not yet found its time to bloom. And now, as the stars trace their ancient paths above, may you find rest beside the stories of quiet lives long past.